Hello and welcome back to Reality Check. Well, this week we've got something special. You might remember back in December 2019, President Trump signed into law appropriations bills that authorised the creation of what's called the Space Force. And intriguingly, this is the sixth and newest service in the armed forces, and we know very little about it. It's obviously been ruthlessly and very successfully lampooned by Steve Carell on a Netflix series. But my colleague, journalist Brian Entin, has had the privilege of getting access to a Space Force facility operated at the Peterson and Schriever Air Force Base in Colorado. And I'm dying to know whether Brian got a ride in the Air Force's secretive X-37B, and I'm most interested to know, what is Space Force all about? Before I bring Brian on, let's have a look at the package he's prepared.
From the outside, it may look like any other military base, but getting onto this base was no easy task. We had to be accompanied by badge-carrying officials and driven in a military van onto base. Once on base, we were only allowed in pre-approved locations. We're quickly reminded how serious these men and women take their roles.
The celebrity of it was really fun early on. Now, it's very challenging because you have to know a lot of things, and there's a lot of interest that we have as a nation in space, and protecting those interests is a difficult job.
A part of that job is keeping track of every single thing floating around in space, from satellites to even an astronaut's toolbox.
Each piece, thousands, tens of thousands of objects, has a piece. We have to see all those objects all the time. We have to maintain track of all those objects all the time.
Our day started at the aggressor barn. From the outside, it looks like a garage, but when we walk in, we were greeted with a tiki bar and photos, almost a man cave kind of feel. But walk a few feet back and you quickly begin to realize this is anything but a hangout. The servicewomen and men who greet us there are called aggressors, and they explain this space is a tribute to the exclusive group of service members who have served here before.
A lot of the heritage of being aggressors is we act like the bad guys in exercises, right? So we draw on some of the heritage of our great power competitors like Russia and China, and we really root our activities to replicate their threats.
We're greeted by members of several branches of the U.S. military. Navy, Marine Corps, Army, Air Force, and Space Force uniforms can be seen in the main area at the aggressor barn. Not unusual on many bases, but it's a reminder of exactly how big the role of Space Force, the youngest child, if you will, of the armed forces, plays in all branches. Like the Marine Corps historically was born out of the U.S. Navy, Space Force was born out of the Air Force, as more of a specialized focus that goes beyond traditional U.S. airspace.
That we ever go to conflict, all of our guys have already seen what's going to happen, they train against it, that they know how to defeat.
We're given an in-depth presentation from aggressors about the history of the aggressors, which dates back to the 1970s. After the U.S. lost many of their air-to-air battles in Vietnam, the aggressors were created as a more in-depth training for pilots. Think of this as the equivalent of the Navy's Top Gun program. Their goal, to replicate the technology our enemies use against us.
We try to bring that intelligence to life and make it real for our own friendly forces.
The Space Force aggressors show us how with somewhat basic, inexpensive equipment, our adversaries can block satellite signals. They turn this machine on, and the Garmin GPS I'm holding suddenly goes dead. So basically with $10,000 worth of equipment, an adversary could take out GPS equipment.
Yes, over an entire area. They could take out an entire airport for just a few $1,000s.
And more sophisticated equipment can do even more damage. Then we head outside, where we see some of the most important weapons the Space Force has in their arsenal: satellites.
There's been exponential growth from our adversaries in the last decade.
China, Russia, or even more primitive adversaries like terror groups can and some have tried before to block our satellite signals that beam back important surveillance images. Stopping that, which Space Force does and does well, is why they are so important to every branch of the military and for every single American. Remember, satellites power our phones, our power grids, pretty much everything, making space the next potential battlefield worldwide.
I think the next war will be cyber and space.
What does a war in space look like? I mean, when I hear space in a war, it's kind of freaky.
It's not just war in space and aliens coming and, people shooting like Star Trek and something like that, but their everyday life could change. Can you imagine not being able to access your money at all on your phone, or even your phone not working at all, having no access to your phone? Our whole lives could change.
So, Brian, thank you so much for joining us. Did the Air Force give you a ride in the X-37B? And what on earth do they mean by Space Force?
I wish, Ross, I wish we would have gotten a ride in it. No, we've been trying for quite some time, probably 3 or 4 months, to get onto a Space Force base. And you can imagine with the military, there was all sorts of back and forth and hoops to jump through and background checks. And we finally got onto those bases in Colorado. We didn't get a ride, but we did get to see, it was interesting access to see sort of behind the scenes of what they do. And of course, you only get to see the things that they want to show you. You know how frustrating it can be doing some of these military stories because it's a very controlled environment, but it was still really eye-opening.
So one of the things that intrigued me off the top is there was a young Space Force officer you interviewed called Devin Rushing, who's what's called a Delta II weapons officer. Now, as I understand it, my friend, there's an outer space treaty that forbids the use of weapons in outer space. What on earth is Space Force doing talking about weapons? What's this reference to weapons all about?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's the first question I asked him too. Like, what exactly does your title mean? It all sounds very sci-fi, almost like out of a movie. When they say weapons officer, it's sort of like a generic term. It's kind of weird, but it doesn't actually refer to specific weapons. At least that's what they say. And they won't talk about having any weapons in space. Like I said, there's a ton of confidential behind the scenes stuff that they weren't allowed to talk about, but they're not acknowledging any weapons in space. And when I asked him what the title meant, he said, oh, it's more of just a generic term. And it doesn't mean anything about a specific weapon or anything. But they did say in terms of war in space, they do believe that the next world war will be in outer space and fought in space. They were very clear about that, which is why, it's now the sixth branch of the military in the U.S., why they say it's so important, Space Force.
Yes, I saw your interview there with the Chief Master Sergeant, who said, I think the next war will be cyber in space. And then she went on to say, it's not just war in space and aliens coming. Yeah. People shooting like Star Trek. What do you mean, not just? I'm having a bit of fun here, but really, it appeared to contemplate the possibility that part of this is being prepared for the possibility of engagement with something else.
Yeah, it's interesting. I went into this really wanting to get the answer to that question. Of course, I've followed all of your UFO reporting and done a little bit of it myself. And I was very interested in what they knew about UFOs because they have surveillance in space really unlike anyone else. They can see, again, they'll only tell us so much, especially when it comes to the equipment and the satellites they have. But, they say they can see 22,000 miles, maybe even more into space. And they've got an entire unit of Space Force. Their entire job around the clock, 365 days a year, is just monitoring space and monitoring every single little object that they can see. So, of course, I was interested in, do you ever see unidentified objects out there? And they were very quick to shut me down. They do not want to talk at all about UFOs or aliens or anything like that. They just kept going back to their entire mission being national defense and threats on Earth, mainly like China and Russia.
So they're not denying it. They didn't categorically deny that they're seeing anomalous objects in space. They just didn't answer the question.
Yeah, they didn't deny it. And it's interesting. We went to the one base where their entire job is surveillance. That's their entire unit. And they've got they call them sensors that they monitor everything that they can see happening in space. And I asked them, is there ever anything you see that you can't identify, you're not sure what it is? Because they catalog all the items that they see. And they said even something as small as a wrench or a bolt that came off of the space station years ago, they've got cataloged and they're tracking so they can see even really, really small objects. And I said, is there anything you come across ever that you can't identify? And they said, no, we haven't had that happen, which again, I think not that they were coached on what they could say to me, but they were definitely very guarded. And it's hard to believe that they're able to identify every single little object out there. But the one officer who I spoke to said that everything that they had seen, they were able to put into some kind of category.
I'm fascinated that they gave you the access, Brian, and I'm actually, they're very good sports in doing this, because NewsNation has been giving the Air Force particularly a very hard time, and this is an organisation that's spun off from the Air Force. But let's talk about the detail of what they're really preparing for, because their mission, let's be honest about it, their mission is fundamentally to prepare for the awful possibility of a confrontation, an international confrontation that, as you say, goes into space. We did a story recently on Reality Check where we interviewed a Major General Roger Teague, who's former very senior in Space Command, and he was talking about how the satellite command control systems that we have in place, that we've had in place since the 1950s, simply aren't enough for the job. And there is a growing concern about the bellicose statements being made by the Russians, implying that they're working on some kind of anti-satellite technology. And you might recall back in February, John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, he talked about the fact that there is indeed some new weapon in development by the Russians. We don't know if it's nuclear or not. We don't know anything about it, and the White House was very quick to play this down. But he did talk about the awful possibility that the Russians are developing some kind of new space anti-satellite weapon. Clearly, a large part of the role of Space Force is to monitor space debris that's being caused by, things like, as you say, an astronaut's toolbox falling out of an astronaut's pocket. But clearly a large part of the problem is space debris. Why is space debris a problem? What did they say to you about that?
Well, space debris is an issue because it could interfere or destroy or damage our satellites, which you go back to. I mean, you think about the satellites now, what an integral part they are in terms of our national defense. And if there was a war, everything for the most part is controlled by satellite now, whether it be the missiles, the aircraft carriers, GPS on the planes, even communication for our soldiers, out in the field, when they're in conflict. So if one of our adversaries was able to take out a satellite or have some kind of technology to interfere with our satellites, they could take down all of those systems, which would, be a major issue for the military. So that, from what they tell me, that's really Space Force's number one mission and concern, is figuring out how to fight back against that, keeping an eye. I mean, there's been reports, you mentioned Russia, there's been reports even within the last couple of months of China launching something into space that they weren't exactly sure what it was. At least that's what they're telling us. Could it have been some kind of new technology to try to take down satellites? That's the kind of thing that Space Force told us that they're most concerned with. And they call them guardians. Instead of like soldiers, they're called guardians. And they took us into a few warehouses where they showed us some of the technology that they're developing to be able to counteract some of those. They call them like GPS jamming devices that would take down the communication equipment.
Now, that was very interesting because I think they actually demonstrated to you how easy it is to disrupt the satellite communication signals that allow the receipt of GPS signals. How easy is it? What did you see?
Yeah, it's very easy. I mean, they have the equipment there that our adversaries would have, and even some basic equipment that like rogue terror groups could use. I mean, it looked pretty basic. I mean, it's like old radio equipment, it looks like. And so they have it there so that they can study it and figure out how to fight back against it. And so they had me hold like a Garmin GPS and showed me that when they turned some of this equipment on, it literally jammed the GPS signal. So it even goes beyond space. I mean, obviously, they're worried about China and Russia having really advanced technologies where they could interact with our satellites. But even on the ground, there's jamming equipment they say that our adversaries have. And again, even smaller terror groups and not even that organized of groups have that they can use on the ground, point towards like a group of soldiers or even like an aircraft carrier that can actually try to jam the satellite signal from the ground, which, as you can imagine, would be a huge issue.
Look, it's quite understandable too that a lot of what we're talking about in Space Force is surrounded in secrecy, because what we are really talking about is the awful probability that in the event of some international confrontation, the first thing that any foreign adversary would do is to try to take out our satellite infrastructure. And it's funny, I didn't realise until I did this story a few weeks ago on Reality Check, interviewing Major General Roger Teague, just how vulnerable we are. I mean, even the communications we're having right now are probably going through satellite technology. Most of the internet, phones. I mean, it's extraordinary how dependent we are on this technology now and how vulnerable we are.
It is. I mean, when you think about it, and I thought a lot about it after I went out to the Space Force base, and I hadn't really thought about it either. But obviously, national defense is one thing, but all of our banking systems go through satellite. Power grids are controlled through satellite for the most part. You go to the ATM, you go to check out at the grocery store, all of that. You try to use the GPS in your car. So if someone was able to take out any of those key satellites up in space, they could disrupt everything. And that's why it's so important. And you mentioned, I mean, Space Force is new. It came around in 2019 under the Trump administration. There was a part of the Air Force that was doing this work before, but it's so important now that it needed to become its own sixth branch of the military. And it's interesting, it got kind of politicized. People kind of made fun of it that weren't fans of Trump. And you mentioned the Steve Carell show. And you Google it on YouTube, there's all sorts of parodies of Space Force. But when I was doing my research for this story, even as far back as former President Bush and Obama, they were all trying to create this new branch of the military. It had been in the works for decades. They all realized how important it was. It just finally came to fruition under former President Trump.
I have to say, they're cool uniforms. I like the Delta.
Yeah.
What does the Delta patch mean? Do you have any idea what the Delta patch signifies?
They've got a ton of different cool patches, and there's different deltas, and each one has a different sort of meaning depending on what exactly they do. But even walking around the building, I was like, who designed these patches? And there's even like it almost looks like cartoons on the walls. It's really interesting, and it's a really different feel than the rest of the military. And I've done stories, I think, pretty much with every branch of the military. And Space Force is a totally different feel. It almost has like a nerdy, I don't mean that in a negative way at all, but almost like a nerdy aspect to it. There's a lot of engineers, there's a lot of people with advanced degrees working there, and you get that feel when you're there. It was really, really interesting.
It's interesting, one of the things I've done in the past was I embedded with American forces at a place called Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq. And when I was doing my preliminary research before I spoke to you, I looked and saw that the first combat operations that the Space Force were involved in was the detection and tracking of the Iranian missiles that were actually fired on the Al-Assad airbase. And I've got friends who were there at the time, and I know how grateful they were that there was early warning. I mean, there were still casualties, sadly, as a result of that attack. But it's very interesting because I think there's a tendency, and I'm guilty of this, there's a tendency to think that Space Force is something that's easily lampooned and that it's a bit of an indulgence to start talking about having a force in space when we're not even talking about a war in space. But it's quite clear that when they're talking about combat operations, what they're also looking at are things like terror groups. I mean, the Houthis in Yemen who are firing missiles at boats in the Red Sea. We're worrying constantly, of course, about North Korea potentially testing new weaponry out over the sea towards Tokyo and other places. And it's quite obvious. For example, here in Australia, we have enormous facilities in Western Australia that are part of this Space Force monitoring system for space debris. And my sources tell me anomalous objects. So whether they're being candid with you or not, Brian, I'm very sure that they are picking up what are called fast walkers. You didn't hear that term being used around the traps in the Space Force headquarters?
No, and again, we were in such an controlled environment. I mean, they only had, high-ranking officials available to talk with us, and you mentioned the coverage we've done in the past. I mean, I think they kind of knew that that question was coming, and they were very quick to sort of shoot me down and say, no, our main, focus is national defense. They don't seem to want to talk about the UFOs, but the capabilities are amazing. I mean, they can clearly see a lot out there, and probably stuff that they don't want to talk about. And when I went to the base, you kind of have this vision in your head of Space Force, and there's going to be little space shuttles, and they're launching up to look for moon men. But it's interesting. It's not like other branches of the military where you would see tanks or you would see planes. It's a lot of computers. It's big control centers where they're looking at big screens, because most of the devices they use and the sensors are up in space. So you would never know looking at the outside of these buildings that there's all these people inside in uniform, basically sitting at computers in these big control centers, just spending 24 hours a day monitoring screens for the most part.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I respect the fact that there's a lot of things they can't talk about for national security reasons. And look, I'm very sure we do need a space force, because it's quite clear that the Russians particularly, but also the Chinese, have been experimenting with anti-satellite weaponry. And General John Raymond, who I think was a previous commander of Space Force, he spoke out a couple of years ago saying that the Russians had experimented with literally maneuvering some kind of mobile satellite in between two communications satellites. It's quite clear that our potential foreign adversaries are experimenting with and testing technologies in space that are raising very serious concerns. And I think one of the problems in telling this story for Space Force is they don't want to show their hand to a potential foreign adversary, but at the same time, they want to raise public awareness by talking to good reporters like yourself that this is indeed a potential threat. It's a delicate balance for them, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I felt for some of them when we were at the Guardian barn, they called it, where they showed us that equipment. I mean, you could tell they were being really, really careful about even talking about Russia and China. They wanted to be careful about what they said, what they knew, what words they used, because it's something they're dealing with every single day in terms of. And I even mentioned, well, I've read articles. There's published reports where this certain thing was launched a couple months ago, and they still didn't want to talk about it. But they're in a tricky position because they want to be taken seriously, and they should, because it's pretty clear. Hopefully we won't have another war ever, but the chances of that are slim, that it is going to be a war that involves space, and what they do is so important, and they want to get that out there, and they want to educate the American public and the world. But at the same time, and they know about all the jokes too, by the way. I mean, again, you just Google Space Force and people make fun of them. So they want to set the record straight, but they have to be so careful about what they say, because all parts of the military are classified in one way or another. But I think with Space Force, it's even to the next level, because it's such an emerging space, and the technology that they are developing is so different and emerging, that I feel like for them it's even more. They have to be even more careful and secretive.
It's funny though. I mean, I just wanted to maybe finish with asking you the question about the name of the squadron that you visited. They're called the Space Aggressor Squadron.
Yeah.
What are the implications behind that term? Is the term aggressor a throwback, or is it something that's designed to hint about what their role is?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Kind of like you said, the gentleman with the weapons title. It's the same kind of thing they explained to me, and it's a throwback. It's not because aggressive. And they talk about space warfare, and you think of like weapons, and you hear the term aggressor, and you think about them being aggressive. And no, they say that again is just the title, and doesn't refer to like anything specific that they're doing in terms of like any kind of aggressive behavior. And again, there's only so much they could tell us. But from what they'll say publicly, there are no like weapons per se that they're operating actually in space right now.
Well, they're not allowed to under the Outer Space Treaty. Yeah. But I think to be fair to Space Force and Space Command, it's quite obvious there is a growing concern that the Russians and the Chinese are potentially moving towards breaching the Outer Space Treaty, which was signed, I think, back in 1967. So very, very good reasons for why the Space Force has been created. And as I've said, there are people I talk to here in Australia, people in my government, who are very proud of the role that Australia plays in helping the detection of space objects. And there are arrays that have been erected right across Western and Southern Australia to actually assist in this work. And I think there's a huge amount of pride here in Australia that as part of the Five Eyes Alliance, we're feeding information, intelligence from space into Space Force and other commands, including Space Command. So I think your trip was a very fruitful and interesting one, Brian, and thank you very, very much for talking to us about it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Ross. It's always nice to see you.
Good on you. Nice to talk to you. So full marks, frankly, to Space Force for giving Brian Entin the access that he did get. It's important that I think we do acknowledge there is important work to be done in space, albeit a lot of it shrouded in national security secrecy and the importance of not upsetting potentially our foreign adversary rivals. So before I go today, there are a few viewer questions that have come in, and we always like to try and respond to our audience. So I'm going to knock off a few of those. One viewer asks me, I mysteriously know about the atomic atmospheric test and its ramifications. Why does a former senior general not know? I think that's a reference to Major General Roger Teague when I was asking him about the Starfish Prime explosion, which was a test of essentially anti-satellite and the electromagnetic pulse weaponry by the United States right back from through the 1950s into the early 1960s. And it's awesome to think about it now. I mean, the implications of this are just mind-blowing. But back in the late 50s, early 60s, America did test weaponry which was involving the explosion of weapons either in high atmosphere or in orbit. And the biggest one of all, I think, was called Starfish Prime, and it was exploded over atolls in the northeastern Pacific. And incredibly, it was seen as far away as Hawaii, the flash, and it knocked out communications and electricity in Hawaii, of all places. And indeed, the impact was felt in as far away as New Zealand, where I grew up. And it's interesting because when I asked Major General Roger Teague, who'd worked in Space Command, he didn't know about the Starfish Prime tests. And I do. I think it's an important piece of American history. If we are expecting our foreign adversary rivals to not deploy anti-satellite weaponry, it does have to be acknowledged that America, along with every other nation involved in space, China and Russia, has at different times tested anti-satellite weaponry. And most recently, I think the US used an F-15 to knock out an old satellite in space just to demonstrate that capability. So moving on, Skinwalker Ranch has a lot of evidence for those complaining the security is insane with military. Ross, question. I'm a skywatcher. I thought seeing a UAP in 2016 was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. For 6 years, I looked at the skies and nothing. Since 2022 on clear nights, I've seen UAP, weird things that disappear and show the 5 observables. Some could have been misidentifications, of course, but in 2022, I saw 4. 2023, I lost count. It's not like I see a UAP every night. There's no clouds and I skywatch, but it's not unusual. I don't do CE5, I just look up. Is there an uptick on the phenomenon? Look, certainly there's an uptick on the phenomenon for me because so many people are sending me reports like yours, sir. I am getting on a daily basis videos from people purportedly of anomalous objects moving either in the atmosphere or in orbit. There is certainly, in terms of reported sightings, an uptick. It's impossible to know whether that's a genuine increase in the number of objects that are anomalous moving in our skies, because frankly, I think what's happening is people are starting to take a closer interest as we're all starting to talk about this. Ever since I started talking last month about Langley Air Force Base, and indeed Eglin Air Force Base, where there's been sightings of anomalous phenomena, I am being flooded with information suggesting that there is frequent anomalous activity around those and other Air Force facilities. Actually, I just want to mention something. I got a tip overnight. One of the stories that's been surfacing is the story about Eglin Air Force Base. And I notice AARO, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, recently announced in its historical review report that a sighting that allegedly took place in January 2023 by a jet fighter pilot out of Eglin Air Force Base over the Gulf of Mexico, where he allegedly saw an Apollo command module acorn-shaped object. The AARO, the Pentagon's UFO investigation office, categorically denied that there was video of that incident. And very, very interestingly, there's an FOI I've just tweeted about where a guy has obtained paperwork from the US Air Force confirming there is video. Somebody's lying. And I know they're lying because overnight I've just received information telling me that the Air Force is reluctant to admit that there is video because the video came from their latest F-22 Raptor fighter. And there were 2 fighters, I'm told, on location that were there when this object was seen. And there is video. It's being declined for national security reasons. Yet AARO tries to make us believe this is a balloon. Utter BS. I'm calling it out. It's a flat-out lie. Next question. Hello, Mr. Ross. Thanks for your amazing work and coverage on this topic. I feel like we collectively are shooting ourselves in the foot again, not you particularly, Mr. Ross, by saying things like no government would come out with disclosure in today's climate, which is true. Yes, it is. But I don't think there is any climate where a government wholeheartedly tells everyone everything. There's way too many players involved in this for that to happen, in my opinion. Whistleblower-based disclosure seems to be the only way forward. Thoughts? Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're in agreement. As you've said, it's true that no government will ever come out with disclosure in today's climate. I think that's absolutely true. And I think part of the problem, part of the dilemma that I'm increasingly becoming aware of is I do think the US government is probably experimenting with non-human technology. I really do. I think the evidence is becoming overwhelming, and you're going to be hearing a lot more from me in the next few months. What are we doing about our own space debris? China is 4 times the population of the US, and yet they have the same amount of space debris. These generals are talking out both sides, I presume both sides of their mouth. What about our space war capabilities? Any updates? Well, we're delighted to tell you that our friend Brian Entin from NewsNation has just visited Space Force, and you've just seen his report on what's happening out of the Peterson-Shriver Air Force Base in Colorado. So yes, we are chasing both what the US is doing to combat potential adversaries in space, and we are monitoring very, very closely, as we have done in a previous reality check, the threat from foreign adversaries to our own technology in space. It's a huge issue. And if and when, God forbid, a next war is fought, it will be fought in space. And we have to be ready for that. And frankly, that's why Space Force matters. Okay, I just have to say it. This is a viewer. Oh, I think my friends at NewsNation have put this in for fun. Ross covers very serious and urgent matters, but I have to fight my fangirl crush with tooth and nail in order to focus on the reporting instead of getting lost in these eyes. Oh, there, I feel better now. Well, I'm glad I'm making somebody happy. Thank you very, very much for those flattering comments. As a 60-plus-year-old man, it's nice to have comments like that, and thank you for giving me a good laugh. That's all from Reality Check this week. Lovely to be able to engage with you again. Looking forward to telling you more about mysterious and interesting stuff in the very near future. Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And please don't forget to click that red subscribe button to ensure you get more of NewsNation's unbiased and fact-driven news coverage.